Dovetail's newest British route in TSW4 has left me with mixed thoughts, but I'll start off by saying that I'm happy with at least getting a particular train that I had wanted to see in the game for ages. This is my 2 cents on the London Overground Goblin Line add-on and the Class 710 electric multiple unit. I'm still referring to the new route as the Goblin because I don't like any of the new names for the London Overground lines, and that's mainly because they already had well-established yet unofficial names. Like the old saying goes, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Dovetail did change the official name of the Goblin DLC in TSW4, presumably because that's what Transport for London wanted them to do, and I can live with that, even though the name Suffragette Line does not suit the Goblin at all. Even so, I still tried to enjoy this route for what it is. Before we get into the review proper, I have one last thing to mention. I looked at the subscriber count recently and noticed that
it's over 9,000!
Yes, I know that meme is very old, but I still thought that was a good place to use it. In any case, I don't know how we got past 9,000 subscribers, let alone past 100, but I'm still grateful for the people who helped get the channel to where it is today by watching and subscribing, although I don't ask or tell people to subscribe like loads of other YouTubers do, for whatever reason. As it stands now, I don't know what to do for a 9k subscriber special, since I've already done Q&As a couple of times. And now we go back to discussing the London Overground in TSW4. The Goblin is a short suburban line running through northeast London, starting at Gospel Oak and finishing at Barking Riverside, the latter being a brand new station that opened in July 2022. I recommend watching Jago Hazard's video on the Goblin, although it was made before Barking Riverside opened. This add-on costs $43.59 NZD at full price, and there was no option to pre-order, for whatever reason. This route is cheaper than I was expecting, but I'm still getting rather bored of TSW add-ons always being so expensive, and at this rate, I might have to stop buying this rubbish before too long, unless Dovetail, Rivet Games, and the other developers can finally clean up their act, but that's extremely unlikely, especially in Rivet's case. The only route that I recommend buying at full price is Just Trains' Blackpool branches. Most routes are simply not worth the full price. Cases in point, ScotRail Express and the Niedertalbahn, as much as I like the Niedertalbahn. There are only 13 stations on the Goblin Line, and going from east to west, the station order is as follows. Barking Riverside, Barking, Woodgrange Park, Wanstead Park, Leytonstone High Road, Leighton Midland Road, Walthamstow Queens Road, Blackhorse Road, South Tottenham, Haringey Green Lanes, Crouch Hill, Upper Holloway, and Gospel Oak. I can't say I'm surprised to see that we got yet another average modern image commuter route, and that DTG only bothered to make something that's less than 20 miles long, because everyone really wants, hey I know, how about a 13-mile long linear route that offers barely anything new and limited replay value? Yeah, that'll sell! Not helping the situation is the fact that we already had the Goblin Line in Train Simulator, but that version was released long before A. Electrification, and B. the extension to Barking Riverside. And before anyone comes up to me with the overused, if you don't like it, don't buy it argument, that doesn't work because A. it's just a pathetic attempt to shut down the conversation when you don't like the other person's opinion, B. I don't know whether or not I'll like the bloody add-on until I've tried it, and C. Dovetail still needs to be held accountable for their bad practices. Dovetail has done this sort of stupidly short commuter line thing before with the Glossop Line add-on. That route only runs for 14 miles from Manchester Piccadilly to Glossop and Haddonfield, but at least it has one little branch at the eastern end, while Goblin doesn't have any branches. I don't expect any Dovetail staffers to watch my videos, since they're probably too afraid of people saying anything they don't like, but I'll still remind them that the problem with short and linear routes is that they get boring very quickly because of their limited replay value and service variation. Take a look at the Harlem Line, Cross City Line, ScotRail Express, Bremen to Oldenburg, and Glossop Line routes, for example. Somebody told me a fair while ago that the Glossop Line was meant to be a filler route released ahead of something much bigger and supposedly more exciting. That's what happened with the Glossop Line, since Train Sim World 4 was released soon after the fact, even though I still think TSW 4 was borderline pointless. Anyway, I have no way of knowing if a similarly big release will follow the Goblin unless it's officially announced by Dovetail themselves. If it turns out to be a revival of the Rush Hour series from 2021, I would be okay with that, as long as one of the routes was a Berlin S-Bahn line. As expected, only one train is included with this route, namely the Class 710 Aventra electric multiple unit, which is part of the same family as the Class 345, 701, 720 and 730 units. And speaking of the 345s, I'm one of the 2 people that don't like TfL's brand name for the routes they run on, so I always call it Crossrail. This is a very modern train, first entering service in May 2019 after an embarrassingly long delay. TfL even had to offer 1 month of free travel on the Goblin to make up for the delay. 54 Class 710 units were built by Bombardier Transportation between 2017 and 2020, but we only get one variant of the class in TSW, namely the 710-2. 18 examples of this 4-car dual voltage variant were built, but the Goblin is electrified at 25 kV AC from overhead wires. And for the longest time, this route wasn't electrified, while the service was run by Class 172 Turbostars between 2010 and 2018. The 710s were ordered to replace the older Class 315 and Class 317 EMUs, which ran on the Romford to Upminster Shuttle and Lee Valley lines from London Liverpool Street to Chingford, Cheshunt and Enfield Town. Those routes were previously operated by Greater Anglia, and taken over by the London Overground in 2015. The 710s also replaced the undersized Class 172-0 diesel multiple units, of which 8 were built in 2010 for the Goblin line. Why anyone thought that it was a good idea to only have 2-car DMUs run a busy commuter line is anyone's guess. As for why the 710-2 is dual voltage in the first place, it's to enable her to run on the Watford DC line from London Euston to Watford Junction. Meanwhile, the first purpose-built London Overground EMUs, designated as Class 378, are still running on the North London line, whose services run from Stratford to Richmond or Clapham Junction, as well as the East London line services from Highbury and Islington to New Cross, West Croydon, Crystal Palace and Clapham Junction. The 710s don't run on the North, West and East London lines, and I suspect this is because those routes are already covered by the 378s. The Class 710 is a unique addition to the TSW stable, and it's a train that I have wanted to see in the game for a long time. This is the first time we've seen a unit with a metro-style interior, where it's all longitudinal seating, and the lack of transverse seats allows for more standing room, and therefore higher capacity. It doesn't sound like riding in a 710 at peak times would be a fun experience. Of course, I have never travelled aboard a 710 in real life, but I do know what it's like to be on a crowded train. That journey on the Glenbrook Vintage Railway in early March was a fucking nightmare. As for the sounds on this unit, I'm indifferent to them overall. Based on the real footage that I've seen, the door sounds are spot on, and the horn doesn't sound awful either. It's a two-tone horn that reminds me of the Class 700 or Class 395 Javelin. But the traction motors are easily the weirdest part of this thing. When the train pulls away, the motors sound like those on a Class 314, but the growl is offset by the sort of high-pitched whine that I expect to hear from a modern EMU. Compared to footage of the real thing, while the in-game motor sound is mostly accurate, that motor noise is actually way too loud. Driving the 710 is an unusual experience. For one thing, the combined throttle and brake lever is very bizarre, because the throttle stage is smooth and the brake stage is notched. One of the few screens that's actually functional is so poorly lit in the daytime that I can barely read the words on it, and it doesn't help that you can't change the brightness. Two screens in the 710's cab are linked to external CCTV cameras, but they remain completely blank throughout the trip, even when you're stopped at a station, and this can be a big visual distraction. I don't like how the seat is off to one side, instead of being dead centre like it is on the Class 700. Incidentally, I might make a video showcasing all the modern, as in post-2015, British EMUs that we've currently got in TSW. You know, things like the Class 385, Class 387, Class 801, and so on. Although the Class 484 was rebuilt from old District Line trains to a very up-to-date standard, I won't include this unit in a modern EMU video because she was originally built in the early 1980s. Timetable mode includes 154 playable services for the Class 710 and 71 for the Class 66 diesel locomotive. The latter will only appear on the Goblin if you own either the Great Western Express, East Coastway, Southeastern High Speed, or ECML Peterborough to Doncaster routes. Curiously, the DB Schenker livery is not on the list of variants to choose from on the Goblin, even though that livery does come with Great Western Express. The 66 is mainly used for container services coming from or going to Ripple Lane Yard, just east of Barking, but you can occasionally see this locomotive hauling different types of wagons. As I've said before, Train Sim World is in dire need of even just one more modern UK freight locomotive. Even the Class 59 would be a welcome addition, despite this design dating back to the mid-1980s and looking very similar to the newer Class 66. Knowing what Dovetail are like with reusing sounds, looking at you Talent 1, I wouldn't be surprised if they reused the 66's EMD 710 series prime mover sounds on a 59, even though the 59 actually has a 645 series prime mover. The 710s run a frequent service between Gospel Oak and Barking Riverside, with the service running every 15 minutes in each direction, or in other words, 4 trains per hour. 6 units are required to maintain the 15-minute headways, and it's interesting to note that they can't run coupled in pairs on the Goblin because the platforms are too short for 8-coach trains. Meanwhile, for people who own the Peak Forest route, The LMS Jubilee Class 460 steam locomotive has 2 playable services on the Goblin, depicting a rail tour going from Barking to Upper Holloway in the morning and back to Barking later in the evening. I suspect she would branch off at Junction Road Junction and meet the Midland Main Line at Kentish Town. This isn't entirely realistic, unless the model appears as 45596 Bahamas instead of a scrapped classmate, such as 45604 Ceylon or 45725 Repulse. But even if the model does appear as Bahamas, it doesn't depict a preservation-era Jubilee, due to its lack of modern-day safety systems, and the real Bahamas has a double chimney anyway, while Dovetail only bothered modelling a single chimney variant. There are some other locomotives that layer onto this route, but I don't care to remember which ones they are since they look out of place on it, and that's largely because they're 1980s or preservation-era models, and they are not equipped with the modern GSMR and TPWS systems. At least the Europhoenix Class 37 and criminally overused EWS Class 66 are properly equipped for modern image routes. Between Crouch Hill and Haringey Green Lanes, the Goblin runs under the East Coast Main Line. If you've got the Thameslink Class 700 and ECML Peterborough to Doncaster add-ons, you will occasionally see the Class 700 and Class 801 units running ECML services across the overbridge near Haringey Green Lanes. Apparently, there's another layer for the heavily weathered Class 66 and railhead treatment train, but I refuse to buy that pack, especially now that I've got the heavily weathered Class 66 anyway. That's because DTG bundled it with the Peterborough to Doncaster route. I guess that saved them the effort required to finally model an entirely new UK freight locomotive that we've never had in TSW before. Here is just one example of the myriad of UK freight engines that Dovetail or a third-party developer should make for TSW. This is the Class 68 in Direct Rail Services colours. As I mentioned earlier, the Class 710s also run on the Watford DC line from London Euston to Watford Junction. This route shares tracks with the London Underground's Bakerloo line from Queen's Park to Harrow and Wealdstone, and yet the 710 does not layer onto the Bakerloo line route in timetable mode. Although Dovetail did explain in a pre-release article that this is due to the way in which the game treats third and fourth rail power, and they're apparently investigating the possibility of adding the 710 to that route, I'm not holding my breath on that due to Dovetail's history of empty promises that go unfulfilled. Does anyone else remember when Matt Peddleston himself promised multiplayer for TSW? Pepperidge Farm remembers. For the time being, people have to use the free roam or scenario editor tools as the only means of getting the 710 to run between Queen's Park and Harrow and Wealdstone. Dovetail missed a trick yet again, and this time it was by not including a separate version of the 710 that's scripted to run on the same full rail system as the tube trains. Yeah, it would be unrealistic, but you'd at least be able to run the 710 on that shared Watford DC/Bakerloo line section in the normal timetable mode. I don't really like to use the free roam mode outside of comparing specific locomotives and units for a video. Meanwhile, out near the eastern end of the Goblin, we see that there's sod all going on at Barking Station. This is the eastern terminus for the London Underground's Hammersmith and City line, while District line trains continue all the way to Upminster. Meanwhile, mainline C2C trains also pass through the station on their way from London Fenchurch Street to Shoebury Ness via Upminster, Ockenden, Basildon or Tilbury Town. I'm not at all surprised to see that Dovetail didn't bother modelling the London Underground S7 stock or C2C Class 357 and Class 720, but that doesn't mean I'm any less annoyed at the unrealistically quiet Barking station. The overground trains used to terminate at Platform 1, but since the Barking Riverside extension opened, they now use platforms 7 and 8. It takes at least 41 minutes to complete a full run from Gospel Oak to Barking Riverside, or vice versa. The reason why it takes so long to do such a short run is due to the combination of closely spaced stations and low speed limits. Although the Class 710 has a top speed of 75 miles per hour, she can only go as fast as 60 on the Goblin, and even then, only on a short section of the C2C line east of Barking. Most of the time, you'll be crawling along at between 20 and 45 miles per hour, and there's a long section from just east of Upper Holloway to Haringey Green Lanes where the speed limit is only 30 miles per hour. The majority of Goblin stations have platforms that can barely fit 4 coaches, in which case you have to pull up next to the stop markers that are usually located right at the end of the platform. The only exception I've seen is on platforms 7 and 8 at Barking. And because of those short platforms, I suggest entering the stations at no faster than 25 miles per hour. Most of the route runs through a very built-up area, and the in-game buildings are set up to have realistic lights at night, but the route doesn't reference the fix because there aren't any red skies at night. They're all black instead. Meanwhile, there aren't many buildings at Barking Riverside, as this station was built to serve a new residential development that's still under construction. This station is interesting for a variety of reasons, not least because of how new it is, but also because it looks like it's designed with provisions for an extension across the river to Thamesmead, if that ever gets built. In any case, it's a very rare thing to get stations as modern as Barking Riverside and TSW. As much as I tended to rake Dovetail over the coals for their myriad of problems, and that will not stop anytime soon, I still believe in giving credit where it's due, but only when it's due. Besides the excellent rendition of Barking Riverside Station, there are some other details and features that I like. For starters, we have working lifts that you can see at Gospel Oak, South Tottenham, Black Horse Road, Barking, and Barking Riverside. They are a welcome improvement on the lifts at Edinburgh Park on Rivet Games' underwhelming ScotRail Express route, complete with a little announcement at both ends. I'm guessing this is to help people who are hard of hearing.
Doors opening, lift going down. Doors closing. Concourse. Doors opening, lift going up.
There are plenty of realistic TfL posters at each station, which help with the immersion. One of the posters is an advertisement for a fictional chocolate bar, and I swear the slogan is a cheesy reference to the New Zealand band called Split Enz. It's a really minor fault in the grand scheme of things, but I couldn't help notice this typo on another sign at Gospel Oak. I also like the mosaic roundel outside the entrance to Gospel Oak Station, located on Gordon House Road. You can find similar roundels at Upper Holloway and South Tottenham, and although you can't see them from the railway itself, it's still good to have little details like this. And incidentally, South Tottenham is one of my favourite stations on the line, aside from Barking Riverside of course. As I explored the route, I noticed that all but 2 of the stations have passenger information screens on the platforms. The only 2 that don't have them are Upper Holloway and Wanstead Park. I have no idea why Dovetail left out the displays at those 2 stations, since they are indeed present in real life. It's still good to see the proper stop markers for the S7 stock, Class 357 and Class 720 EMUs at Barking, but at the same time, it's very on the nose to see Dovetail subtly acknowledging the existence of those units despite their complete absence in-game. When are we ever going to get a C2C route in TSW? And by the way, it needs to be the entire network from London Fenchurch Street to Shrewsbury Ness via Upminster, Basildon or Ockenden, with no sections of the route cut off. At the end of the day, I still have mixed thoughts on the London Overground Gospel Oak to Barking Riverside add-on in Train Sim World 4. I still think that a better choice for an overground route would have been Highbury and Islington to New Cross, Clapham Junction, Crystal Palace and West Croydon, complete with the Class 378, instead of yet another linear route, of which this game has far too many. Despite still being disappointed at Dovetail for making yet another short route, I will say that the overall quality of the Goblin is at least decent, or rather, actually good for once. The Class 710 is neither too easy nor too difficult to drive, and I really like the well-detailed stations. In some ways, the Goblin reminds me of the Glossop line, but neither route is better than the other, in my opinion.